So the Israel-Hamas war is still having some very strange repercussions in the West. Tom, you wrote about this week. I mean, one of the strangest developments has been on TikTok, where Osama bin Laden seems to have had a kind of viral recovery. People discovering his letter to America, his justification for attacking the Twin Towers, and finding a revelation in it. They seem to almost agree with it, bizarrely.
Yeah, it's kind of like a sort of Generation Z pin-up, apparently.
Yeah.
Like Move Over, Greta Thunberg and Harry Styles, the new kid on the block. Yes, this is a very strange phenomenon. It sort of kicked off last week, and whereby people began to notice that on TikTok in particular, this has started to produce a bunch of videos and a bunch of conversation. There was at least kind of 2 million views on the hashtag for Letter to America, which of course was this screed, this piece of propaganda attributed to Osama bin Laden that was published about a year after 9/11, essentially trying to explain why he was engaged in holy war against the West. And obviously, given the current conflict, it also has a lot to say about Israel. I mean, America's support for Israel in the Letter to America is basically presented almost as the original sin as to why America is fair game to be attacked, full of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories as well about Jews controlling world affairs and so on. You look at the videos in particular, that first of all, they're a little bit cautious about what it is that they're supposedly finding so revelatory.
Yeah.
But saying things like, we've been lied to our entire lives, I'm having a existential crisis as a consequence of reading this. It's important not to suggest that, you know, America's woke 20-somethings are a few videos away from becoming jihadists or something. It's fair to say that the hashtag exploded much more beyond that 2 million views as soon as mainstream journalists started covering it and everyone went over there to kind of gawp at it, as it were. And since then, TikTok have clamped down on it. But at the same time, I don't think you can dismiss it. And also, I think there's clearly a sort of chiming between that sort of Islamist, terrorist, jihadist mindset and what a lot of these woke youngsters have been brought up on. Yeah, it's not to draw a direct continuum for them, but this is something that we've seen develop over some time. So there is a kind of conversation, a kind of parasitical relationship between kind of woke leftism and jihadism and Islamism. There has been for some time. They draw on quite a kind of anti-Western attitude, the idea that the West is basically the root of all evils. They also draw, particularly as we've seen in recent weeks, on a deep Israelophobia to outright anti-Semitism, which has become quite core to both sides. I think they're kind of drawing from the same well to a certain extent. And this is actually something that historically bin Laden and more of the kind of Western-focused propagandists within Al-Qaeda would seek to exploit. They would seek to exploit kind of notes of racial identity politics, or they would seek to exploit a kind of Western self-loathing in order to try to curry favour against certain kind of useful idiots, usually amongst the supposedly anti-imperialist Western left. So this, as a kind of parasitical relationship, has existed for some time. And I think this is just one of the more ridiculous, easily mockable manifestations of that in terms of these Generation Z woke influencers suddenly latching onto this text and thinking that it's got a lot to say to them in the here and now.
I mean, Candice, has it really just got to the point where people will latch onto anything that is vaguely anti-West, that it could be Hamas, it could be bin Laden, and suddenly that seems sympathetic because it's against us, because it's against the imperial America or against the allegedly imperialist Israel?
Yes, I mean, what I found interesting about that whole TikTok phenomenon was how performative it was. So the first person who posted it, she was like, oh, it blew my mind. And then afterwards, there were loads of videos of people saying the same thing. My mind is blown. And cynical me was like, have you even read it? And I wondered if they'd even read it or if they were just performing a role on TikTok. I mean, I just didn't know. I couldn't tell. But I think it's true. I think, you know, there was a whole truther movement after 9/11, which you guys will remember that, you know, it didn't even happen, that it was a false flag operation. But I think this sentiment that's being expressed now, this actual sympathy with bin Laden, that is something new. And that is this new sort of anti-Western. He was seen as a liberation figure. He's someone who's striking back against the West, against colonialism. And that is something that's very specific to the age we live in. And it comes absolutely out of identity politics.
Yeah.
I mean, this sort of thing has existed, but on the fringes. But now it's in the education system, and it's sort of seen as a respectable viewpoint. What I found frightening, though, is if they did actually read the letter, and I'm not convinced that all of them did, is there was blatant anti-Semitism in there that most of us would just think was red flag instantly. But for them, it wasn't.
Homophobia as well. You know, giving a lot of these seem like the kind of queers for Palestine sort of community in terms of people making these videos. You know, outright, you know, the part of the reason America is right to be attacked is because of its fornication, homosexuality and gambling. That was something he wasn't too keen on. So, yeah, there's a bizarre alliance, certainly, between these two groups.
Okay, Candice, you wrote very well for us earlier this week about the strange, not quite alliance, but the almost blind eye that lots of so-called intersectional feminists have been turning to Hamas, particularly the sort of mass rape of women. So, I mean, do you want to say something about that?
That has been truly shocking, and I see quite a few people have started speaking about this now. It really is very striking. I mean, women's groups, who you would think would be the people who would denounce this the most, have gone very quiet, or they've denied it, or they've attempted to contextualize it. I mean, Sisters Uncut, who we know to be this very radical feminist group, they haven't said a word about it. Not a word. I mean, they've organized a lot of these pro-Palestine marches, and that's their right. They can do that. But they haven't once condemned what happened. In fact, they've even said that it may even be just a form of resistance.
Yeah, or that it's racist to say that this is specifically, you know, they say an Arab problem, whatever, when people are trying to tell them, look, Hamas did this thing.
I know.
They said, you know, you shouldn't weaponize rape to the ends of Islamophobia.
But then you don't get to call yourself a feminist. I'm sorry. Once you have legitimized that, you are not a feminist. It is unprincipled feminism. And it is because they have a deep, deep, deep bias against Israel to the point where any sort of violence against the Israelis I don't know if they condone it, but they ignore it or they try and contextualize it. And it's very, very, very disturbing because the experiences of those women have just been completely erased.
And Tom, another thing that people have tried to ignore, contextualize, deny has been the evidence that's been emerging from the Al-Shifa hospital. You know, for a long time, people have known that that's a Hamas base of some description. Don't know how, we haven't known how significant it is, but people have tried to pretend that this isn't the case, even as weapons have been found, even as tunnel networks have been found. I mean, what have you made of that?
I found it really dispiriting and strange. I mean, not least because, as you suggest, there's always been this understanding that, to what extent is unclear, but the fact that this hospital was being used by Hamas for, shall we say, non-medical purposes. I mean, there was an Amnesty International report back in 2014, I believe, which was talking about it being used as a centre for interrogations and torture. There have been cases going back even before that where you had medics within the hospital being expressing concerns and even going on strike over it being used by Hamas, again, as for political purposes, often to harass and go after people who were pro-Fatah. And so this is a kind of open secret. And obviously you had the Israelis constantly putting out various pieces of information over the course of the past week, trying to substantiate why this was target, not in the sense that they want to level it to the ground, but why they needed to get in there to try and find Hamas fighters, and nothing seemed to work. So there was that shocking video release of Hamas fighters running into the hospital on October 7th with some of the hostages which they'd just stolen from southern Israel. And yet this video, which seems to put them so bang to rights, you know, they're openly using this as kind of part of their operations. You know, you had Owen Jones musing about how, well, they took the hostages to hospital, and that's a reason to make this a sort of legitimate...
when they're injured,
Yes.
The only justification or rationalisation for that kind of response is that he's trolling. Nothing else makes any sense. And then you saw this as well when suddenly videos were released and information was released about the tunnels that had been discovered on the general kind of, the land, the compound in which it was taken. And again, people were just sort of dismissing it as, well, you know, and then of course there was that...
Hospitals have basements, don't they?
Hospitals have basements, don't they? And this was slightly before some of the evidence that I've just been talking about came out. But you had Jeremy Bowen on the BBC when the kind of first haul of Kalashnikovs and suicide vests had been found. He was like, well, if you spend time in hospitals in the middle of the East, that stuff just tends to be there, you know, and this stretches credibility to such an extreme degree. And it has just gotten to the point where, of course, fog of war, one needs to be sceptical about claims on all sides. I get that. That's not what this is. No. This is outright cynicism, which in some cases seems to play into a kind of, well, of course they are lying, aren't they?
Yeah.
And whilst one wants to be careful about about the accusations one flings, you cannot help but conclude from the media discussion, particularly on kind of left-wing Twitter, about the hospital and the evidence emanating from it, that what we're dealing with here is not just skepticism, it's a kind of grim, knee-jerk, of course they're lying prejudice, which has been, pretty hard to take, to be honest.
Yes, I completely agree. I think it's gone beyond healthy skepticism. I mean, obviously, as journalists, especially when you're dealing with war and conflict, you have to try and verify everything, make sure that what you're looking at is genuine. But I mean, when you are explaining away someone being dog-marched into a hospital, being dragged with someone who has a meat cleaver in their hand, and you're saying, oh, they're just being taken for medical treatment. I mean, that is going way beyond it, way beyond it. But I think that this is just of a piece, I mean, I think people just have these deep, deep, deep biases. And I think in any way questioning them, I think it makes them even wonder if they're moral, that they're not on the good side. I mean, if Hamas can do these things, well, then maybe what I've been supporting is evil. And I don't support evil things. And I wonder if that's something that's going on there.
Yeah.